Let's get you more reaction then to that medium-term budget. Pieter Faber is a senior executive for taxation at the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Pieter, good evening to you. Thank you for your time. Just listening to the breakdown of what has gone into this budget, it might be somewhat of a bitter pill to swallow, given, yes, there's this good news of a surplus in as far as revenue collection is concerned. But of course, there are thousands of public servants that would have been listening out to hear some indication of whether the call for increased salaries would be accommodated in this budget, but government digging in its heels and rather spending that money elsewhere.
Well, I think you're correct. It's exactly that, is that the good news, or so it's called, because the 83 billion they're referring to is actually just projected for the full year, so we're only halfway through that year. So it's still guessing that we'll get there in the first instance, on the one hand. But as you said, on the other hand, there's other costs that weren't in the budget, one of it being especially the negotiated, or current salaries being negotiated, haven't been budgeted for. So whatever the unions do settle on, that still needs to be paid as well. So the budget picture is incomplete, so to speak.
About some of the significant announcements. Xolani touched on the issue of Eskom, the issue of Sanral. Let's get to the extension of the social relief of distress grant. That, I imagine, government would have been very mindful of the fact that there are millions of South Africans, of course, that have been depending on that grant and would very much want a sense of stability around it.
Well, I think that's exactly been the problem. And not just in South Africa, I must note that the social relief actually had a Global Accounting Alliance meeting over yesterday, and there's similar concerns that people get this expectation that these things will last indefinitely. And that's the first thing is, yes, we can give it, and it probably is quite necessary, but what happens after 1 April or 1 March 2024? And I think that's exactly the concern is what happens thereafter.
Were there big issues that you felt yourself still asking questions about following the announcement of the minister?
Well, I don't think it's as much big questions as the fact that there weren't big questions. I think it's been a lot of exactly the same, namely we've seen the same promises of primary budget surplus, reducing debt. But when you look at the detail, we just can't see where that is. And I think the one big thing that hasn't been included in Feb, Ukraine war's impact wasn't factored in. Now we all also know about the potential grey listing that's going to happen. What we did not see is factoring in, shoot the grey listing. The grey listing now seems to become more and more of a done deal come February next year. And the impact of that of foreign direct investment and the cost of South Africa's debt. And obviously the impact on the economy, doing business, etc. That doesn't seem to have been factored in at all, the impact on the economy, on the estimation. So I think that is the one big thing that's still outstanding, and its impact together with, as I said, we don't know what the final number is going to be that government's going to settle on with the public sector unions.
It is quite interesting listening to the minister talk about the issue of grey listing, of course, because he's speaking from a perspective that offers hope that, and an impression that there is still something that the country can do to avoid being grey listed. Of course, when you talk to several other players within the sector, the majority seem to be of the view that, like you're saying, it's pretty much of a done deal, that there's no way that we can avoid it at this point. When you look at the action that government needs to put in place, and as far as its financial controls, particularly foreign financial controls, are concerned, is what the minister is saying tonight backed up by what we need to have in place structurally?
Well, I think the point was made by the current acting Director General of Treasury himself to Parliament, saying the big problem is not our legislation, and that seems to be the instruments that have been implemented in haste. It's the enforcement side. So if you actually read the Financial Action Task Force findings, the majority of them are more concerned with actual enforcement. And I think that no proposals have been made as to how we are going to fix enforcement in the next 6 months. So it's all great and Dan, you tell people if they do X, they are transgressing the law. The question is, are you picking up these people that they're transgressing the law, and how are you sending them to jail? And if you're not doing that, then you've failed. And that second part is the one we have seen nothing being implemented. And I think that is the concern. To put that in perspective, in the beginning of the year, we said, well, the NPA says it needs 1.7 billion to process all the state corruption cases. Our proposal was to halve the budget of the VIP unit, which will give them the 1.7 billion rand. That was obviously not accepted. So we're still sitting with an NPA saying, well, we don't have money to do this, so we can't do this. And if that's the situation, well, then we haven't fixed anything on the enforcement side. And I think that is why it's probably a done deal, because nothing on the enforcement side seems to will change when the plenary sits in February when the final decision is announced.
And the reality is that funding the NPA is a lot like MPs were describing the funding of SARS. Ultimately, that pays off.
Correct. So we've now seen that this enforcement side, whether it's SARS, whether it's the NPA, those have upside benefits to them, and therefore they have more investments than anything else. And at least if you do provide them the funds, we can complain about further other things that they aren't doing, but at least we aren't saying that they are underfunded. And I think we need to remove that as a factor in the discussion. Let's then focus on the other things that might be structurally wrong at either SARS or the NPA, but money shouldn't be the problem, and not when we're talking about amounts like 1.7 billion rand to effect what is one of the big issues that the world is essentially now going to create the detriment for us in the financial sector because we have not actioned these things at a sufficient rate.
Pieter Faber, we'll leave it there for tonight. He's a senior executive for taxation at SAICA. Let me thank you for your time.